Hey, hello everybody. Welcome to Café Historique. My name is John Lutz. I teach in the history department at the University of Victoria, and I teach a course there. Well, I will be teaching a course in January called 10 Days That Shook the World. And that was the inspiration for actually all of Café Historique originally, but it was the inspiration for a series called 10 Days That Shook the World. And here we are, the second speaker of this year, and we're looking forward to a season in January of more speakers that are talking about days that shook the world. First, I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on the traditional territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt people, the Lekwungen speaking people, and I don't know how many people here were here last month when we did this. So quite a few repeat. I can't see everybody here with the lights, but I was saying last week that, at first I was awkward about saying traditional territorial acknowledgements because, they've become in many cases just kind of a rote thing you say, and that's all you ever do for reconciliation. And I expressed then, as I expressed now, that I feel a lot more comfortable giving a territorial acknowledgement now that myself and my colleagues in the history department are doing things to help and move things towards reconciliation. And thank you. I'll mention a couple of the things we're doing, and I should say that forthcoming in the January season, we have 2 Indigenous speakers who are speaking on days that changed the world from their perspective, so I'll talk more about those at the end of the talk. I think one of the things we can do, luckily as professors, we have a podium and a forum, but I also wear a second hat, change my hat. I'm the vice president of the Victoria Historical Society these days, and we had a speaker last week, Cheryl Bryce, who's a wisdom keeper from the Songhees First Nation, and she spoke to us on transformer stories that the Songhees and Esquimalt tell about how this landscape became shaped. And we have a speaker in January from the Victoria Historical Society, Rai Moran, who's a Métis, but also led the archives at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he's going to speak about residential schools. So if you're like history and you're interested in history, I'm going to do a little promo for the Victoria Historical Society now. I think membership is like ridiculously cheap, $24 a year or something like this. Join the VHS and attend our talks, which are both live and on Zoom these days. So I feel like as a history department anyway, we've done doing our thing and doing our best to help with reconciliation. And I'm very happy to acknowledge that we're living and working on traditional territories of other people's territory. I'd like to also make my regular case that we're all volunteers. Our speaker as a volunteer, I'm a volunteer. The history department organizes this with volunteer labor. And we like to do this at a zero cost to the history department. We don't want to pay in a way for being volunteers. And Herman charges us the very reasonable fee of $200 to rent the space. They offer us this fantastic technical support. We've got live streaming going on thanks to Herman. It's a bargain at $200, but we would love to think that you might want to throw in $2 or $3 into our kitty here, our fundraising bag. So at the end of the night, we can walk away and say, hey, that didn't cost us anything. That was great. So I'm going to pass around this little gift bag here. and ask you if everybody, I think we're about 80 people today, if everybody puts in $3, we make a little bit we make $240 on the night, and we can save 40 for next time. So I'll start passing that around right here.
I'm putting in 4.
Somebody's putting in 4, okay. Do I hear 5 or 20? Yeah, that's also good, all right? If you put in 20, like a lot of us don't carry change anymore. You put in 20, you don't have to put anything in next time, okay? I mentioned the Victoria Historical Society because we had a speaker there earlier this year, and he's the same speaker that we're having here tonight at Café Historique. This speaker, at that time, was talking a little bit about his book, Orca, How He Came to Know and Love the Ocean's Greatest Predator, and his current research for his forthcoming book, Devilfish, The History and Future of Gray Whales and People. This is Jason Colby. Now, Jason is one of the rarest species that we have here in Victoria. He was actually born in Victoria. But there wasn't much going on in Victoria for a 9-month-old when he was that age, and so he decided to leave town and move to Seattle area where he was raised and went to high school, I guess. And he did some stints as a commercial fisherman in Alaska, worked in fish farms in Puget Sound. And he and I had the same response to working in the commercial fishing industry. In my case, it was gooey duck diving, and that was, we went back to school. And he did his PhD at Cornell University, and that research resulted in his book, The Business of Empire, United Fruit, Race, and U.S. Expansionism in Central America. So you can see his scholarship covers a wide range of things between U.S. foreign policy in Central America, orcas and gray whales and human-animal relationships, and tonight he's going to be talking about the warming world. Before coming to Victoria to join the history department in 2007, Jason worked as a professor at the University of Texas in El Paso, and now he is both a professor and chair of our history department at the University of Victoria. Even though you may not have met Jason in person before, the chances are excellent that you have heard him on local radio, TV news, or read him in print because he's a frequent contributor in local media on U.S. politics and on everything to do with whales. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jason Colby.
Hi there. Is this on? Can you hear me okay? Okay, I got to make sure that my levels are okay. I must say that it is absolutely delightful to be here after at least a 2-year hiatus. This is my first time speaking in public in person for 2 years, and I know that things aren't truly back to normal, but actually seeing people's full faces in front of me is quite delightful. So thank you for being out here, and this means a lot to our department, the history department, and its relationship to the community, to have so many people that are eager to sort of connect with us and engage in the life of the mind and all these sort of pressing issues. So thank you for being here. It's really, really great to see you. So you know, in theory, I'm supposed to pick a day that shook the world. I sort of picked a month, and you know, and I'll tell you why that's significant in a second, but I had to pick a specific day, and so I picked my mother's 10th birthday. This is when my mom turned 10. I love the idea of having February 10th. All right, so let's, without further ado. In February 1957, let's just say February 10th, 1957, Scripps oceanographer Roger Revelle published a paper. And this is what's called, you know, true academic action, this description, publishing a paper. And it was entitled, quote, Carbon Dioxide Exchange Between Atmosphere and Ocean, and the Question of an Increase of Atmospheric CO2 During the Past Decades. So, February 1957. Not a sexy title, I know, but it was groundbreaking at the time and certainly in retrospect. In it, Revelle and his co-author explored the geochemical impact of the massive and growing human release of CO2 into the atmosphere. Like most scientific articles, it was fairly short on text and fairly heavy on data, But it did include a number of critical interpretive passages that explored the implications of this, including the historical aspects of this phenomenon. And I'll give you just a couple little passages here, and you'll have a sense of this. For example, it observed, or Ravel and his co-author observed, that, quote, in the middle of the 19th century, appreciable amounts of carbon dioxide began to be added to the atmosphere through the combustion of fossil fuels. This had accelerated massively after World War II, they noted. Quote, and this is the passage that's always arresting to read, I think, 60 years later. Quote, human beings are now carrying out a large-scale geophysical experiment of a kind that could not have happened in the past, nor be reproduced in the future. Within a few centuries, we are returning to the atmosphere and oceans the concentrated organic carbon stored in sedimentary rocks over hundreds of millions of years, unquote. Now at the time, and don't blame him too much, this is very scientist of him, at the time Ravel was not so much alarmed by the potential ecological and environmental implications of this as the sort of scientific ones, meaning he was worried that this profound global experiment, as he called it, would not be accurately documented and studied before it was over. But others were worried, quite shortly after getting a glimpse of these findings. In November 1957, a news article commenting on Ravel's and his co-author's article noted that the findings seemed to indicate that, quote, a large-scale global warming with radical climate changes may result. Now, as far as I can tell and have been able to find, this is actually the first printed use in this sort of phrasing of global warming. And it's coming in direct response, really, to Ravel's article. In hindsight, I think it's fair to say that Ravel's revelation, if you want to call it, this publication, this article, was a pivot point of scientific knowledge, certainly, scientific understanding of what many now call not just global warming, but more broadly, the Anthropocene, right? The age in which human beings became arguably, and increasingly inarguably, the most important geophysical force in the world. But in fact, and I want to just step back for a second, even as early as this might seem, 64 years ago, he wasn't hardly the first to think about the implications and the potential ramifications of the human impact on climate. I'm going to just jump back a little bit farther. 100 years before they published this article, French author Eugene Houssard observed, and he was talking specifically about the rise of industrialism in Europe in particular, but also North America. He observed this. So this is 1857, 160 years ago, right? Quote, in 100 or 200 years, crisscrossed by railways and steamship, covered with factories and workshops, the world will emit billions of cubic meters of carbonic acid and carbon dioxide. And since the forests will have been destroyed, these hundreds of billions of carbonic acid and carbon dioxide may disturb the harmony of the world. As it turns out, your all-time understatement, right? A few years later, Irish physicist John Tyndall proved this through a lab experiment by establishing that CO2 played a clear and direct role in regulating climate by absorbing solar radiation. He does this through lab experiments. In 1903, the Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius went even further, calculating, and this is again just theoretical, he's a mathematician and chemist, calculating that a doubling of atmospheric CO2 would increase the mean temperature of the Earth by 5 degrees Celsius. Now I want to emphasize again, that's I started in 1857, 1903. At the time, this is all theoretical and mathematical. None of these early scientists could have anticipated the spike in CO2 emissions They were caused by the spread of cars, right, in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and especially the explosion of emissions after World War II, what many environmental historians and ecologists refer to as the Great Acceleration. The Great Acceleration of human consumption of resources, but also emissions of CO2 and such. Now, after that great acceleration after World War II went hand in hand with an explosion of climate research and ecological research. In the context of the Cold War, understanding the atmosphere and the oceans, climates, weather, these became strategic priorities for the Cold War states, especially the superpowers, particularly with questions of the operation and navigation of nuclear missiles, nuclear submarines, the possibilities and in fact likelihood of polar warfare, the necessity of understanding the various climates of the world and how they shaped weather patterns and so on, how the physics of the ocean worked. All of these things become actually strategic priorities. Governments, especially the United States, but Soviet Union and others, channeled massive amounts of funding to research. Most visibly, I shouldn't say most visibly, but sort of most publicly, this is expressed in a sort of a bizarre phenomenon that takes place in 1957 and 1958, which is called the International Geophysical Year. And on one level, this is an organized international effort by the governments around the world to channel funds and resources to help study different areas of the world and climates and ecologies. And so on the one hand, it's sort of framed as collaborative and cooperative, a human effort to understand the world. But of course, this is the height of the Cold War, and so it was very much framed by the Cold War. And a lot of people forget that a couple of very obvious expressions of the International Geophysical Year, even though nobody uses that phrase anymore, a couple of the outcomes were Sputnik and NASA, right? These are actually these come out of the research that's done in the International Geophysical Year. Excuse me. It was in this context, you probably noticed, timing-wise, that Revell publishes his findings, right? Right at sort of the beginning of the International Geophysical Year. His paper was a key step. And one of his researchers, one of his postdocs, I believe he was, at the time at Scripps Institute in La Jolla, soon took this insight that Revell and his fellow researchers had and took it to a next level. And he did that atop Mauna Loa. So we come to our sort of next section of the lecture. This young researcher's name was Charles David Keeling. He tended to go by David or Dave. He was not yet 30 years old when Revell's paper was published. But Keeling had already, by that time, contributed to some of Revell's thinking, and he had already developed a unique method for sampling atmospheric components, in particular atmospheric carbon dioxide, which showed, this method showed that levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide remained fairly uniform in the northern hemisphere no matter where you went. They changed over the course of the year, but regardless of where you were in the northern hemisphere, they were fairly stable, meaning fairly consistent. In the mid-1950s, in fact, he had convinced the US Weather Bureau to establish research stations to measure atmospheric carbon using this technique. And in 1958, so the year after Revell's article, he got funding to set up his first one on the big island of Hawaii. I think I got a shot of this here, yep. This is after a couple years, by the way. This is not at the very beginning. Like much of modern science, the project, Revell's project, relied on imperial power. Hawaii was, after all, a US colony. It would become a state the next year, but remains, one could certainly argue today, a US colony of sort of conquered territory. Although native Hawaiians regarded the volcano of Mauna Loa as sacred, US power, US control of the territory of Hawaii gave Keeling access to this space, which enabled him to take consistent CO2 measurements year after year, beginning in 1958. The result was the Keeling curve, a quite sort of famous, simple but famous curve in the history of climate science. So you'll notice, obviously, we're probably all familiar with this. I can't do the laser pointer. I don't think on the screen here, but you'll notice obviously the general upward trend. But you'll also notice the oscillations, right, that you see within each year. So the oscillations represent the annual plant cycle in the northern hemisphere. So when plant growth fixes carbon, essentially pulls it out of the atmosphere in the spring and summer, as plants are growing, as leaves are growing. And then, of course, the leaves drop and rot, and eventually that carbon sort of goes back into the atmosphere. And you're sort of seeing the ups and downs, the natural oscillations of that plant cycle in the northern hemisphere. So the oscillations are natural. The curve is not, right? When he took his first reading in March 1958, Keeling found CO2 at the level of 315 parts per million. You sort of see at least the beginnings of that. He really didn't feel comfortable sort of giving his strong data until the mid-60s, but this is the very first measurement is 315. In the following years, Keeling didn't just expand the Mauna Loa station, but had constructed another one in Antarctica to be able to monitor and measure CO2 in the southern hemisphere. And he keeps doing this. He and his research team keep doing this year after year, decade after decade, in fact. In the 1960s and 1970s, as the environmental movement took off in the United States and spread around the world, Keeling and his colleagues continued to gather and analyze data. And many of you are quite aware that the environmental movement, that emerges in the early 1960s, the mid-1960s, is not thinking about climate change necessarily. It's thinking about more local and even regional questions, but not sort of that global question. That hasn't come to the fore. But still they're gathering. By the time the Cold War was ending in the late 1980s, their research was already influencing international policy discussions. In 1988, the United Nations formed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. 4 years later, in June 1992 in Rio, the United Nations passed the Convention on Climate Change. Meanwhile, Keeling and others continued their work measuring atmospheric CO2. By 2005, the year of Keeling's death, that measurement had passed 370 parts per million. Today, it is nearing 415.
Can you repeat that?
Today it is, I'm sorry. By the time of his death in 2005, it was at 370 parts per million. In the last 16 years, it's gone from 370 to almost 415. It's about 413 right now, parts per million. Needless to say, this is sobering. In contrast to the belief that many young people have today, that research on and perceptions of and concerns about climate change are new, we've actually had clear data since the late 1950s. And that data has only gotten clearer and better and stronger and more compelling in the last 60 years. And yet the problem has gotten worse. The increase of CO2 has not only continued, but accelerated. Which begs the question, if we have such good science on this, why? Why has it gotten worse? And why has it accelerated? Now the answer lies certainly to a great extent in global economic growth during that period, not just in the larger and richer Western nations, but in the non-Western world as well, which saw an explosion of economic growth during that period. And that, of course, has brought spreading industrialization around the world, spiking fossil fuel use. As one way to think about it is that much of the world aspired to the unsustainable consumption of resources that defined sort of middle-class life, especially in North America at the high point of the Cold War. But the answer to this also lies in the politics of science. Getting to my next section of that outline. The paradigm of Western science, especially modern Western science, is essentially, and this is an oversimplification that would horrify my scientific colleagues, but is essentially to gather data and determine what is going on. In this sense, despite all the range of methods and approaches and framings that it uses, science remains primarily a descriptive, not a prescriptive approach, meaning its primary purpose is to figure out what's going on and why, not necessarily to use that to draw conclusions and recommendations. And certainly science remains, to this day, not activist in orientation for the most part. Since World War II, in fact, scientists have tended to avoid policy recommendations and political interventions. And in fact, when they have done that, that is almost routinely dismissed by fellow scientists as no longer being a scientist, as going political, as becoming an activist. And this ultimately is actually potentially threatening to career prospects and to one's identity as a scientist, going political. This is something, frankly, that humanists like myself, historians, never really face. If you come out and make a strong statement about something you feel, should change, you're not in danger of being not a historian, right? Now, in the same period, environmentalists grew increasingly concerned about these questions of climate change, this sort of broader global question. But they adopted a largely science-first approach to solving it, meaning that they emphasized more precise data, better science over social mobilization, political change, policy change, or even moral suasion for the most part when it comes to the question of climate change. And so by the 1990s, this had led to a paradox. Scientists were getting an ever clearer and more alarming picture of carbon emissions, potential global warming, these anthropogenic, these human-driven impacts on not just specific environments and ecologies, but the global environment. So they're getting an ever clearer picture of this, but this wasn't translating to political urgency or policy change. Equally important, the fossil fuel industry itself took aim at science, paying researchers, usually much better than a university could, paying researchers to argue that the data and the conclusions about carbon emissions, about climate change, were more unclear than other scientists were claiming, and that there was, and this is the sort of gold standard when you're trying to undermine science, there's no real consensus among scientists about this. That's the argument. Scientists, I think understandably so, considering their orientation and their institutional reluctance not to go political, scientists struggled to respond to this. How do you respond to someone attacking your data or just saying, hey, it's more complicated, not everyone agrees? Even Ravel himself hedged on such questions. Like others, he championed the belief, and this is very comforting to scientists, and I understand why, the belief, it's almost a faith, I would say, that if you just do enough, quote, good science, it will inform correct decisions. It will inform correct policy, if you just do enough good science. But the interface between science and society, certainly the interface between science and policy, rarely works that way. Historians of science have put it this way, that science clearly doesn't have a forcing effect on policy just by the fact of being good science. First of all, I'll just give you a couple reasons why this is. And by the way, don't hear what I'm not saying in any of this. I'm a profound supporter of scientific research, and I rely to a great extent on scientific research for my own writing and research. But why does the interface between science and policy not work clearly like that? I'll give you a couple ideas. One is, I think that the results, and so fossil fuel industry certainly discovered this, the data, I should say, and the results of research can always be questioned by those determined to do so. Second, and related, the call for more research can be actually detrimental, even though it sounds, quite reasonable. What I mean by that is, scientists themselves, their success is measured by getting grants and doing research, and so if you ever tell a scientist, if you ever ask a scientist or a doctor, what can you tell us about this? Well, this is what we think, but we need to do more research, right? So that's certainly, a common refrain in science. But if you're talking about governments and you're talking about policymakers, the refrain of more research is quite useful politically because as a delaying tactic. Governments are almost always willing to fund more research than to make difficult decisions, right, that affect people's livelihoods, economies, and certainly the structure of fossil fuel use. I mean, it's a lot easier to throw a few $1 million at research than it is to re-examine, your billion-dollar infrastructure that relies on fossil fuel. And this underscores, I think, a stern reality. Scientists can track the changes in carbon levels in ever more minute detail. But those changes and the crises they are causing, and we're highly aware of them, certainly in BC today with the flooding and such, the crises that they're causing are human-driven, and I really want to emphasize that. Scientists can measure by their collection of data what's happening in the world, but those crises are human-driven. They're human crises, and we need to understand humans to grapple with them. You can't just collect data and understand humans. Now, this is why I would argue that humanists and certainly historians need to be involved in these discussions, and there's a real problem with the way public discussions are often go, and you have these questions, and when they're environmental questions, it's always assumed that the only person you go to is a scientist, right? But these are usually and almost always human and really historical problems we're trying to wrestle with. So what do we know about humans? Just to throw out a couple of sweeping generalizations. First of all, we know that humans are wired to focus on short-term desires and threats and struggle, certainly as individuals, but especially as groups, to cooperate against abstract, longer-term dangers and threats. And second, probably not a surprise to anyone, humans are highly visual creatures. And we tend to focus on questions, whether they're sort of ones we find morally compelling or dangers, if they have a visual component. And we have a harder time when they're harder to visualize. So of course the climate crisis is, to some degree, the global climate crisis is invisible, meaning we can't actually see with our own eyes how the parts per million of carbon have changed in our air. There are certainly visual representations that people try to use to get people mobilized. I'll throw up a couple here that will almost inevitably create an emotional reaction, which will illustrate my point. This is Glacier National Park in the United States, my home country, which they're going to have to rename pretty soon because there's essentially no glaciers there anymore. By the way, that's 10 years ago, right? The one on the right. And this one, which was quite potent at the time, the image of a polar bear. Of course, polar bears need ice floes to be able to feed off of. Now, I would emphasize that it's entirely possible that this polar bear is starving because of climate change. It's also possible this polar bear is sick. We don't actually know, but it's a compelling framing of the climate crisis that's easy for people to get their head around in a way that even the Keeling curve isn't, right? So despite the difficulty of sort of framing this in a visual and politically and morally compelling way, certainly a growing number of people, and we've seen mobilizations in the past few years, especially among younger people, many people view climate change as the defining moral and existential challenge of our time. And they argue that because of that it should supersede other questions. Not all of them argue this, but they should argue that many of them argue this is the screaming question of our time. But this approach, that claim of everything else should sort of take a backseat to solving the climate crisis, that can, and doesn't always, but it can tend to evade historical questions of responsibility and power that in fact explain the present or the climate crisis. So I want to sort of add the historian's interpretive voice here in particular to how we might understand that. And also understand why, for example, it is incredibly hard, we've seen again and again, for nations to cooperate with one another to reduce CO2 emissions. Well, I should say, warming emissions, methane, another one, right? In its first century, the Industrial Revolution, if you think about it as sort of having its little liftoff in the late 18th century, but really sort of shaping much of the 19th century. In its first century, the Industrial Revolution was limited to North America and Europe, really, Eastern and Midwest North America and Western and Northern Europe. Until 1900, and think about these these ratios, they're pretty fascinating because people don't tend to frame the climate crisis this way. Until 1900, Great Britain and the United States accounted for 60% of all historical human CO2 emissions, those two countries. So of all the CO2 emissions that human beings had pumped into the atmosphere in all of their history, those two countries were responsible for 60% of them, right? And the vast majority of it in less than a century, really. That didn't change that much over much of the 20th century. The British and the US still accounted for 57% of the historic CO2 emissions by 1950, and still 50% by 1980. So if you think about it, by 1980, still half of those human emissions were those two countries. And I don't mean by year, I mean historically. And I think this highlights the link between anthropogenic climate change and world power in a way that's often at least underemphasized. Because after all, these were the two great world powers of the 19th and the 20th centuries. And much of what made them great powers was their ability to access, process, and consume fossil fuels in order to project their power around the world. For this reason, some have argued that the Anthropocene should be renamed the Anglopocene. But in the past 40 years, things have changed. By 2000, China had passed the United States as the largest emitter of CO2 in the world, and India took third place from Russia. South Korea had passed the UK, and Indonesia and Brazil had passed Germany. So you see sort of not just a passing of baton, so to speak, but this is the revving up of the industrial economies and the fossil fuel economies of the non-Western world. In other words, you have the developing world starting, as part of its process of aspiring to give, their people middle-class lifestyles, we're now not just emulating the West, but emitting the carbon on par increasingly with the developed world. Now, this reality doesn't erase the importance of history in understanding the crisis or our way out of it, I would argue. Without history, and tell me how, or reflect on how few times when people talk about the climate crisis, they ever talk about history, right? But without history, we can't actually understand how we got here. We can't understand the historical and cultural obstacles to solutions as well. Indeed, these historical realities and these historical processes have structured international efforts to address climate change, and I should say they've often torpedoed them. Among the most important steps in recent years came in late 1997 when world leaders gathered in Japan an international conference that resulted in the Kyoto Protocol. In it, participating nations extended the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and they emphasized in particular, and this is really important because it was framed historically, the Kyoto Protocol, they emphasized 2 points. First of all, they emphasized the rather obvious to many people, but important to emphasize, that global warming was indeed occurring and that human impacts were driving it, right? Human emissions were driving it. And second, it emphasized that that this had to be understood on a differential level among the different, not just nations as they were emitting at the time, but with respect to their states of development and their historical emissions. Together, the signees committed their nations to reducing greenhouse emissions, but on a differential scale based on their development. And that agreement was framed to go into force once it had enough signees in February of 2005. But the Kyoto Protocol was controversial from the beginning, and many of you may remember it was actually a real point of contention in the 2000 presidential election in the United States. Because it acknowledged in a forthright manner the historical responsibilities of wealthy nations, and it emphasized the limited ability of developing countries to pivot to economies that were less fossil fuel intensive, then it really placed the burden, at least initially, in the period envisioned of cutting back emissions, it placed the burden primarily on developed nations because they were both the ones historically responsible for human-driven climate change and those that actually had the wealth and the capacity to pivot. Many in developed worlds, and certainly in the United States, rejected this. And George W. Bush, in fact, attacked it in the 2000 campaign. It was quite a clear dividing line between him and Vice President Al Gore. Over the following years, 192 nations ratified the protocol, but the United States didn't. Kind of ironically, a little bit like the League of Nations, the United States was the driving force and then didn't end up ratifying. The United States didn't, and that profoundly weakened it, of course, because it was, at the time, the second highest emitter after China. And in 2001, the Bush administration actually withdrew it from consideration in the US Senate. Now, we all know that other events, world events, soon took center stage. The attacks of September 11th, 2001, brought a US-led wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which were, at least to a degree, structured around Western needs for access to oil. And the reverberations, of course, of those conflicts, continue to this day around the world and certainly in the Middle East. In the meantime, consumption of fossil fuels continued to spike around the world, particularly in the growing economies of China and India. And much of this came from coal. Many people consider coal a 19th century power source, but its use is still growing today, and not just in Asia. From 2011 to just 2012, so just a year span, the percentage of electricity produced from coal in Britain grew from 30% to 42%. And there was never a year in history in which more coal was burned than 2014. China's coal use now tops 5 billion tons per year. And as a result of metrics like that, many activists focus on China and India, sort of these economies, these large economies in the developing world, in their search for blame as well as solutions in the climate crisis. But this, of course, reopens divisions that Kyoto had tried to bridge. As one Chinese diplomat put it in 2009 in response to this focus on China and its emissions, quote, "The climate crisis is the result of a very uneven pattern of economic development that evolved over the past 2 centuries, which allowed today's rich countries to attain their current levels of income, in part through not having to account for the environmental damage now threatening the lives and livelihoods of others." However accurate that may be historically, that kind of rhetoric made it more difficult to secure Kyoto, which increasingly fell apart. In 2012, Canada withdrew, for example. By that time, President Barack Obama had come to power in the United States, and it seemed that international momentum was again building for some kind of a climate accord. The culmination of this effort was the Paris Climate Agreement. It was signed in late 2015. And the deal was another effort to really put that UN framework convention into some kind of policy form, into action in a way that was cooperative and international. The stated goals of the Paris Agreement was to keep global temperatures under 2 degrees Celsius warmer, I should say to limit it to 2 degrees Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial era. And preferably, it said, 1.5 degrees. So even at that time, the goal is not to sort of keep a stasis. It's to actually limit the damage, right? Limit the damage to hopefully 1.5 degrees Celsius in terms of global temperatures. Although it fell short of many of the targets that many people wanted, it represented a consensus among nations to channel investments toward lower emission technology as well as carbon removal. It was completed with the strong support of the Obama administration, which considered it really a crowning achievement, and it has since been signed by 195 nations. This is, hopefully you guys can see this a little bit, but I might have to walk up and talk about it. But by the time Obama left office, so this is early 2017, the U.S. led the world actually in reducing carbon emissions. It had made the sharpest reductions. And there's some sort of revealing and interesting data, that some of that trend has actually continued. Today, for example, the U.S. is 16th in terms of per capita carbon emissions, and Canada is actually 7th. So Canada per capita actually emits more than the United States. Well, let me actually, I can't really wander over here and still be at the microphone, but you can get a sense here. Let's see if this actually, I don't think there's a pointer, sorry. But you can see here, this is the United States here. Yeah. You've got sort of major emitters in the world. Asia, almost all of that is China, of course. You're looking at you have many other players here. It's interesting that you've got the major emitters, and then the rest of the world together is just 19%. The Trump administration had different ideas, right? It thought coal was beautiful, and it withdrew the United States from the agreement, and went beyond that, tried to actually silence, remove, and sort of scuttle scientific research, and also access to scientific data on the climate. But as it turns out, we learned from the Trump administration, to its chagrin, that denial doesn't make facts go away, and it doesn't make data go away. And in fact, the problem has continued to get worse and accelerate. The IPCC currently forecasts a temperature increase at a rate faster. I'm going to try to say this slowly so everyone can grasp this. Projecting a rate of temperature increase faster than any in the evolutionary history of mammals. In fact, the current carbon levels haven't been seen on Earth in 4 million years. And we're headed toward an atmosphere that hasn't been seen on Earth in 15 million years. And while we think about this as mostly a terrestrial story, because we're terrestrial creatures, the ocean is actually experiencing the greatest change, which should be of interest to us because about 60% of our breaths come from the ocean, right? Among other things, food and other ecosystems that sustain our lives. In the industrial era, the ocean has absorbed between 30 and 50% of all carbon released by fossil fuels. As a result, its acidity has increased markedly, which is very bad news for carbon-based life in the ocean, and a lot of that life in the ocean is indeed carbon-based, especially sort of at the lower end of the food chain. It's also perilous for coastlines because the ocean has absorbed about 90% of the heat produced by global warming. So this isn't just about melting ice caps and how that just raises the levels, kind of like melting ice in a cup. It's actually expanded because of the heat that it has absorbed. It is these realities that have scientists and engineers focused not just on how to slow global warming, but how to enhance the resilience of vulnerable ecosystems and especially vulnerable communities, including insular communities that are in danger of literally losing their homelands as oceans rise. At the same time, I would argue that the world has yet to reckon with a contentious truth. And that is that in the 20th century and the early 21st century, global power was and has been directly tied to consumption of carbon-based fuel, especially oil. And this certainly remains true today. A primary reason that China and India are rising powers is because of their rising consumption of fossil fuels. So hence, the challenge of climate change negotiations is this. They don't just involve negotiating carbon emissions. They involve negotiating the allocations and the future of global power. And that tends to be a contentious question among nation states. And I think I'll leave it at that. Yes, absolutely. I can. Now, I want to emphasize, by the way, that I am not a climate scientist, and thank you. And you know, the history of sort of climate science and such is, you know, it certainly overlaps with my own specialty in marine environmental history. But as you heard, I'm really more of a specialist in sort of coastal history and human whale relations and things like that. So if I will tell you if I can't answer a question, and don't be surprised if I can't. Humility is never a bad thing, right? So, questions? I've got spotlights in my eyes, so.
See one on the back of the bar there. Over on this side.
Go ahead. Oh, I'll go here first.
I have a question. I love how you talk about the hanging low for seeing and in a sense the sign off for seeing.
Right.
I wonder also about the Alberta scene. But I wonder, you talked about us being highly visual, but could you maybe think about addressing one of the reasons for our headlong rush towards climate warming as our short-sightedness in terms of achieving our individual or family goals,
Yes.
you know, our consumption as opposed to being highly visual or, you know what I mean?
Yep, absolutely. That's a great question. So if I could distill that, what was your name? Tony. Great question. So the question sort of turned around was, you know, yes, we have these sort of these trends and these epics, but can we sort of talk about how, you know, one of the challenges here, especially to the short-sightedness of people, is their sort of focus on individual, but also sort of family goals and consumptions, and it's a great insight, and I think, I mean, it's too big for me to give sort of a true expansive answer, but what I will say is, I think there's absolutely a dynamic here, and I encounter it in my own life, my friends, family, is, you know, on the one hand, you know, a growing conviction and concern that this really is an existential crisis and it's going to affect everyone. It is affecting everyone. But on another level, first of all, sort of a lack of knowledge about what's the best thing you can do as an individual, but also a bit of a, whether it's a hopelessness or sort of a unwillingness to curb our own choices, that certainly helps drive this. What I would say, and I'm a big believer in this, is and again, I'm not saying that responsible consumerism isn't really important. But what I would say is one of the real dilemmas and perhaps shortcomings of modern sort of environmentalist thought, I think, is that it's put too much pressure and emphasis on people and their individual choices, which can almost feel hopeless, right? I mean, you just go through your life and you try to sort of make responsible choices, but, you know, you buy an electric car, but the electric car needs, you know, it actually has a huge carbon footprint just to make the car, you know, and just to give an example, right? And what I would say is, you know, I'm a big believer actually in sort of collective political action, meaning, you know, we've tended to make our biggest changes in responses to environmental crises when we express those collectively, especially through government and international action. And, you know, you have an example like, you know, the acid rain crisis. You know, ultimately that wasn't solved by people, you know, no longer using those products. It was actually regulation and removal of those products that caused that. And so it's not to say that individual action isn't important. I do think we tend to, especially when we're in an environmentally conscious town like this, we tend to, you know, really worry about our individual choices, which I think is really responsible of people, but then also can get a little judgy toward other people. You know, you're not recycling as much as me. Why don't you have an electric car? Well, you know, those are all easier questions when you're a relatively privileged community and I tend to think that, you know, a question like, why is Canada, you know, a relatively wealthy country? Why is Canada the 7th per capita emitter in the world of carbon? Well, that's not really, I wouldn't actually put that on individual Canadians and consumers. I would put that more on the sort of interwoven relationship between the federal government and fossil fuel extraction, right? And as well as consumption. So I would say that those individual choices are important absolutely where our priorities are our families and their happiness, right? Which is why I think this really should be on governments, policymakers and international action. Not that individuals can't support that, but these are certainly questions that no one all of a sudden in Victoria forswearing the carbon economy is going to make a dent, right? I mean, I remember actually first giving this talk and then going on a trip to San Diego. And by the way, in full disclosure, I mean, like, my carbon footprint because of my airline travel is probably ridiculous, right? And so I go to San Diego after giving this talk, and I just remember looking at this 14-lane highway and just thinking, yeah, nothing that happens in Victoria makes a difference when the scale of things you see elsewhere, right? And of course that's dwarfed by the infrastructure you see in China. So yeah, there was a question actually by the bar there. Yeah, sorry.
You touched upon it in your answer you gave just now. We do have a couple of success stories. I was going to mention, of course, ozone and CFC.
Yep.
Now, the elephant in the room is the CFC industry back in the 90s wasn't a $1 trillion industry. Fossil fuel is. But putting that very large thing to one side, how does that affect your narrative in terms of offering what you see as paths forward?
Yeah, I mean, as an environmental historian, I quite treasure success stories, and I think people need to hear those because people generally, but especially young people, I know this is true of my kids. I have two kids that are two young teenagers, and the narrative and sort of dark clouds of hopelessness are circling over them, and people do need to hear that solutions are possible, that there are success stories, that it's not just a sort of a narrative of decline and collapse and disaster. But you're absolutely right. We have our success stories. We have lots of success stories in environmental history, but we've actually never had a problem of the scale, first of all, of climate change, the human-driven climate change. And we've also never had a problem that, for lack of a better word, as you put it, is so difficult to wrestle with because of the profound power, the great power of the interests involved, right? I mean, I tend to see it as at least relatively positive that several of the large fossil fuel producers, not all, but several of them have actually acknowledged the reality of human-driven climate change in a way that they were fighting in the 1990s and even the early 2000s. That's positive. But I tend to think that questions like this or dilemmas like this can't generally be resolved without pretty serious mobilization that puts tremendous pressure upon sort of officials and policymakers. And that's just hard to do, like I said, with something that people perceive in all these different ways, right? I mean, if you think about the sort of the moral urgency and the clear visual nature, for example, of what sparked and launched the Black Lives Matter movement, in this past year versus the mobilization certainly, but the sort of more atomized version of it in favor of stopping climate change, you sort of see the challenges, right? So I wish, as a historian, I don't actually try to make predictions, and I struggle, honestly, to come up with a compelling solution other than that kind of mobilization. But I do think that, that's the only thing that actually drives policy change, and that's the only time we've ever actually seen profound policy change, including in environmental sort of questions. I mean, another example would be the sort of controversy around atmospheric nuclear testing in the 1950s and the fears of it contaminating especially mother's milk, right, for babies, and how that uproar actually did drive the end of atmospheric testing. And that was actually international in the sense of having a couple key players, but we're talking about something that is sort of a dilemma that every single nation is wrestling with. It's hard. I wish I had a good answer to that. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much. You are such a blessing to us that are here and anybody watching online, because you raise more questions in a sense. It's not like you're giving us answers, and But I want to say that I'm in my 70s now, and I am alarmed at the world. Climate change is not my issue. And I want to say that one of the things, when I heard you say Canada is 7th, Canada to me is a 1% contributor. And I don't know if you've ever heard that, but I've sure heard it a lot. And I believed it because I've lived all over Canada, and we have very little industry that poisons the atmosphere. Not non-existent, but very little. Nuclear reactors are my greatest worry because they have no way of dealing with the spent fuel. And it's buried all over the world, and France used to bury it in the ocean. But I just want to back up a little tiny bit. I have been mobilizing myself for years. My electric bill monthly is $33. I can be proud of that. And I work hard. I eat a lot of raw foods, which are healthier for you. I keep my heat down low because it's good for me to live in cool areas. I have no wrinkles. I'm not joking. So anyway, I want to say that there is a solution, but I don't think the solution are these huge, or these huge things that they just had over in Europe for climate change and everything. 40,000 planes and 70,000 people. They're making it. They're making it happen. And I always thought that a lot of these huge wins in the world were caused by the hundreds of thousands of jet planes flying around at 800 kilometers an hour. That makes wind. But when COVID happened and they all got grounded, I thought the wind would die. But it didn't. But it's a very interesting thing. And my question to you is, how do you sort through the bullshit that can baffle brains?
Oh, well, let me start off by saying I wish that my sons considered me a blessing too. I think it's useful to. You're absolutely right that Canada is between 1% and 2% of the contributor. I mean that I would say that doesn't mean Canadians can't think about it in the sense that, even if you're not, even if you can't structure the solution because you're not a locality like Victoria or a nation big enough to actually be responsible for the problem or the solution, you can model, right? I mean, that's in lots of ways that can be sort of the most powerful form of influence for sort of carbon footprint. So I do think it's significant that Canadians have a relatively high footprint. And it is true that there's lots of Canada that doesn't emit a lot. It's also true that the tar sands are one of the dirtiest and least efficient, forms of extracting fossil fuels. And so there are sort of parts certainly of Canada that contribute to this. How do I sort through the bullshit? I mean, our times have changed. Obviously, there's a much more fractured sources of information and data than we used to have. But still, I think the most useful tool you can have, both as a citizen, as a scholar, certainly, is to be able to sort of sort through what are quality sources for your information and what are not. I will say, I have a very healthy respect for expertise. Not to say that I always accept everything that any expert says, but I am aware of how much work it took for me to get vaguely knowledgeable about a tiny little part of human history. And so I do tend to sort of trust expertise of, say, climate scientists or, oceanographers and various marine ecologists and such that I talk to. Not to say that they're always right, but to say that it's really useful to always be asking. I mean, it's a sort of a trite response, I know, but really useful to always be asking sort of where's your information coming from? What are your sources? And it's something that's challenging as a teacher too with students, right? Because students tend to at least start their research by sort of Googling, and they find, Google doesn't sort by, this is really solid scholarship and this is crap. It sort of puts to the top, So that's sort of a useful, just a useful framing, but I don't have there's a lot of bullshit out there.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Are you familiar with Bjorn Lomborg's research? Swedish.
I know that. I mean, not super familiar. I know the name. Yeah.
Did a survey of world leaders and I think 1,000 people, and categorized world crises
Yeah, I mean, so I have another way to interpret that data, which is that climate change, both the crisis and the solutions, don't get politicians elected or expelled from office, right? And politicians and policymakers in general, like all humans, tend to, sort of frame their priorities, either consciously or subconsciously based on sort of self-interest, right? And so you do have the reality that, if you're a politician thinking about a 2 or a 4 or an 8-year window in your career in your next election, are you going to potentially anger constituents by trying to change their consumption habits, or are you going to try to sort of pass policies that they see as sort of concrete benefits? And I would also say that, that's a really important question for poorer countries, right? Because, it's hard to convince, understandably hard to convince a poorer country struggling with, disease, malnutrition of kids, collapsing public education systems and infrastructure. It's very hard to convince them coming from a wealthy country, your first priority should be dealing with this climate crisis we caused in the last 150 years. I mean, that is really a screaming issue. And you can understand them saying, well, you know what, let's make sure that kids aren't starving and that they have a classroom, and then we'll worry about that. And so there is a real danger, and this is often called more broadly, the kind of environmental imperialism or even environmental racism that is often sort of claimed. And there are elements to this that are true, that, the environmental movement, when it emerged in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s in Canada and the United States and elsewhere, was pretty white, was pretty middle class, and was pretty focused on concerns relative, connected to the concerns you would have as a white middle class North American. And so the broader questions of sort of what does environmental justice mean in the context of, colonial and post-colonial histories in places like, Southern Africa, those look really different than if you're in Victoria, right? And so finding a way to connect and explain why climate change actually is a profoundly important issue is a challenge. Now, I would say, actually, I think it's a fairly easy sell in the sense that most poorer countries, especially smaller and insular ones, are the most vulnerable to the sort of the most, catastrophic forms of climate change, right, or expressions of climate change. And so I think that's part of it is sort of connecting those to questions that matter to those nations. But it's a dilemma, right? How are we doing on time, John? Okay. Hi. Oh, hey. Other events that happen sort of globally that are significant? Yeah, I mean, if you're looking for both sort of international gatherings, but also sort of climate catastrophes, it's sadly, quite easy to find material. I mean, I thought about actually talking more about the kind of the phenomenon of Al Gore's tour and the Inconvenient Truth, which I thought was quite an important moment in popularizing and making sort of commonsensical the research and the implications of climate change, at least in North America. That's certainly a relevant one. I mean, we've seen certainly extreme weather events that have sort of and I could talk more than you would want to hear about, the impacts on things like, salmon populations in the North Pacific and probably the shifting sort of ecological regimes in the Bering Sea and how that impacts, whales and such. But yeah, it's kind of depends on sort of what you want to grab. And for me, sort of putting together this talk was about both sort of showing the longer term context of climate science that I think a lot of people think is much more recent, but also at least showing how sort of international efforts have taken shape to address it, but really continue to be frustrated. Yeah. I don't have did you have an example that I should use? Okay. All right. Thank you. Is that?
Any more pressing questions out there?
Oh, I have one back here.
Okay, go ahead. One
Yep.
more.
Well, that's a loaded question.
Can you restate that?
The history. What do I think is the future of industrial sabotage and eco-terrorism? Well, I will start off by saying I'm not a proponent of violence. And I do tend to think that I mean, even though one of my favorite novels, The Monkey Wrench Gang by Edward Abbey, is quite compelling. I do tend to think that that sort of peaceful demonstrations that have high visual impact have greater influence on sort of public discussions and policy than sort of actual acts of sabotage. Partly because certainly in the North American context, it's very easy to, regardless of how you might justify such a thing, it's very easy to paint something as essentially terrorist if it's attacking private property, it's attacking someone's livelihood, potentially endangering people, right? Then it's quite sort of counterproductive. I would say that, you know, even in the case of Greenpeace, that Greenpeace's most celebrated and influential moments have not really been acts of sort of property damage or kind of violence. They've actually been more about capturing visual moments that as Bob Hunter called it, one of the founders of Greenpeace called it the mind bomb. I would actually call it now going viral, right? The potential of something being visual. And so, you know, the demonstration against Soviet whalers off this California coast was so potent because they got video of people trying to stop whaling and the sort of violence, and that's what made it so influential. It wasn't actually an attack on private property. So I would actually say that I love, you know, things like what happened became the battle in Seattle, right, in 1999, when I lived there, was, you know, it started off as a peaceful demonstration against the WHO and was sort of redefined by anarchist kind of attacks on private property, but started off as a pretty potent and influential protest against, you know, with labor cooperation against the WHO. And so, I'm sorry, the WTO. I mean, I do think that tends to, I mean, generally speaking, my view of activism is most effective when it can not just preach to the choir, but it can actually reach out and connect to values that others share, even if they're not in the movement. And if you can speak to those values, hey, you know, we're fighting for values that you share, that tends to have more sort of a more potent influence publicly. But
About message, not
Thank you.
damage.
Thank you for the question.
So in a few moments, I'm going to invite you to join me in thanking Jason. But before that, a couple of things I guess I would say in response to this.
Gift bag.
The gift bag is circulating around, and I see it in the back, but it'll also be by the front door if you haven't seen it, if it hasn't come by here yet. It was an amazing talk, Jason, and you know, I have a 21-year-old son who's studying kind of environmental economics right now, and his major concern in the world, his major concern is climate change. And he's taking personal responsibility by stopping to eat meat, for example. And I'm told that the data shows that the one thing that we can all do, even more than driving electric cars, to reduce our carbon footprint is to eat less red meat and less dairy. So there's something for you. I'm also he's also got me reading a book called Ministry of the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, and I don't know if where that question about terrorism came from, but this book, Ministry of the Future, is set in about 20 or 30 years, 30 or 40 years, and I recommend it to you, but it's a future where we've come to terms with climate change, but in this fictional world, part of the reason was through terrorism, people blowing up airlines as they were flying through the sky and burning up carbon. So before I thank the speaker, though, I want to tell you one thing about the speaker. If you really enjoyed the talk, you'll be pleased to hear that Jason is speaking back here again in Hermans on January 11th in our competitor series, Café Historique. And he's speaking at that time on From Killers to Orcas. Now, I didn't mention this in my introduction, but if you've been to the Royal BC Museum to see their exhibit Orca, it is basically based on Jason's book, Orca. And if you haven't been to the Royal BC Museum, please go and see not only the Orca exhibit, but the rest of the museum, which they're threatening to close all the human history part in the museum after Christmas. I'd like to tell you about our forthcoming speaker. So we're starting again with Café Historique. Our traditional day is the first Tuesday of every month, and the first Tuesday in January is 4th. So it's coming right up, January 4th. And our speaker will be our colleague Beatrice de Alba Coach, and she's going to speak on a day that changed the world, the 13th of August, 1521. And I know you know what that is. That's the fall of Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, basically. And then other speakers will be coming up, and I've confirmed the speakers but not the dates, so the order necessarily, but my colleague Sarah Beam will speak on a day in February 1556, an explosion in infanticide prosecutions and executions. Our Indigenous colleague, Patrick Lozar, will speak on the date 7th of October 1763, rights, repression, and resurgence in Indigenous North America. Andrew Wender will speak on the 1st of February 1979, Khomeini returns from exile. And our colleague Go Gong Wu will speak on the 4th of June 1989, Tiananmen Square. If you haven't made a chance to make a donation, I know you really want to. My colleague Dave will be at the front door with that little gift bag, I think, if it's not there already. But now is a moment, I think, well, actually I will thank our speaker, but I also want to thank the staff here at Herman's. So we've got Sam behind the light board back there and the sound. Thank you, Sam. We've got Megan and Rosemary. Is that right, Rosemary? Rosie, thank you, Rosie, for such great service today. And now finally, a fantastic speaker, what a fantastic talk, leave us inspired, Dr. Jason Colby. Look forward to seeing you in January.
You won't believe this one, but when I worked for Greenpeace, my specialty was whales, and I happened to work on its feeding platform, and it didn't eat me.
I'll be much more of an expert in the next one than I was in the But it was nice to just see everybody here and start to feel like we're vaguely normal, eh?
No, we've been back since September. Yeah, the first day of September was nice to kind of welcome everyone.
How many have you done now?
We did 2 a month. We skipped December, right, because everyone's out to their Christmas parties and doing all these big things like that. So we do, crikey, it must be about 12 a year now. Yeah. Well, I'm astronomy. I'm a cosmologist.
Have you done it all?